I'd like to welcome Professor Marie-Christine Janssens, professor at the Faculty of Law at the Universities of Leuven and Brussels. She has published extensively on copyright, trademark and patent-related issues. She's a specialist in plagiarism, and she's also a member of the Commission on Scientific Integrity at KU Leuven. So welcome, Professor Janssen. Maybe it's good to explain us what a Commission on Scientific Integrity does and how it works.
Yes, hello. I don't like you to call me a plagiarism specialist, no. Because then my commission would have more work to do. This is one of the cases that we sometimes get. The Commission of Scientific Integrity, I think now all the Flemish universities have set up such a commission. I know that because we are thinking, that was also announced in the journal newspaper article, that there is an attempt to set up also a national Flemish commission that would be, is it an appeal or a higher level to go to when there are complaints regarding social misconduct. Now, typically our commission, we have been set up to listen to people who have problems. That's the main aim. Also to give advice to our academic superiors, what can be done, and from what we learn from the practical cases, so that we can make advices also as regards raising awareness to let know not the students, but this commission is not for students, it's only for academic personnel at a university, but to let them know that it exists, because indeed there is a threshold that we see which is difficult to take for some people, some researchers to come to the commission. Typically a file would start with we do not like to call it a complaint, because we like to keep away from the judiciary as much as possible, so make a report, and then well, in the commission we have several people, and the chair of the commission would then appoint 1 or 2 members to look at this file.
To investigate.
To investigate the seriousness, whether there is a problem. That is the first stage. We decide, is there a problem or not? And then we go further, investigate further, and come with a conclusion. Now, I can tell you, we never know from each other who is treating which case, because a very important element in the whole procedure is confidentiality. Maybe one thing I didn't hear tonight yet, when we get these reports, it's not often about big falsification or fabrication problems. It's often about authorship and copyright infringements, and it's very often within the same research center, sometimes because there is already some friction between people of the team. And it's funny, these cases, there is maybe some falsification or some problem behind it, but it's not always the most important reason. But that's not a good stimulus to come to the commission if that's the background. But you should not negate that either. Of course, I cannot report. I don't think my university has already made publications on the number of cases we deal.
I asked them, but
this is for them to respond. I cannot tell you. I read in the newspaper article you mentioned about the Vrije Universiteit Brussels case that Antwerp rector mentioned that they hadn't yet had cases. Hasselt, no, even not. I cannot tell. There are no cases. I'm glad. I'm able to tell we do have cases, because it would look funny, weird even, to come here and say, oh no, we have no problem. There is substantial evidence. I'm not a specialist. I've never studied this evidence. I'm just working on the floor, as you say. But that would be contradicted by the evidence. There are certainly problems, and we are also more and more trying to work at more transparency towards our rules, because that's another thing I wanted to respond to. I do not think we are lacking rules in Flanders today. We have like
too many
two
rules.
important, maybe too many, but there is a Belgian code which was agreed between the two regions, between the two parts of the country, which Leuven abides by, and I assume, and I think I'm almost sure also the other universities. This is the Belgian Code of Scientific Integrity, together with the European, I have it here, the European Code of Conduct for Research and Integrity. So we do not all apply US rules, but we have own codes. So sufficient rules, but there are not sufficient researchers that know about the rules. So
that's indeed the problem.
Clear.
But maybe about these figures, 2% of researchers admit having fabricated or falsified data. Do commissions on scientific integrity get enough dossiers on their desk when you see those figures? Maybe.
No, it's clear the data are not reflected in the work we have at the Commission.
Yes. So what to do
but
about
these data
that?
this is new. As you say, there's always probably been fraud, but the research which is done and the data and the public, the news awareness, that's, I would say, something new the last 4 or 5 years, the year when we were set up. And maybe the Netherlands, we take also an example from the Netherlands, what I personally like, I'm not talking here for the university, and what we maybe should aim even more at is transparency. Because you don't know the numbers of my university or other universities, you don't know what kind of files, you don't know the decisions. Now there is, for the Netherlands, there is a website of the VNSU, Verenigde Universiteiten Nederland. You get all the reports there. I look at them because sometimes I get inspiration, what kind of conduct leads to what kind of reporting or sanction. They publish everything, of course, fully anonymized, no names. You cannot track these cases down to certain persons or institutes even.
That should be promoted
that
in
That would
Flanders
be a good
too,
thing,
I
so
guess,
people maybe would be... Encouraged is maybe not a good word, because you do not want to start a war on people you don't like, but you will need to find a balance now.
But maybe those low figures, or that there are not many cases at the commissions of scientific integrity, is a problem with the whistleblowers. Are whistleblowers protected enough?
First of all, looking at my cases, I don't think that the majority was reported by whistleblowers. This was, if it is about authorship, which is often the case, or copyright infringement, it's the person who feels harmed who comes to the commission. So I have no clear memory of one or more clear cases where there was an external, not from the same science team, that would blow a case. I don't know in the VUB, which it was also within the same science group, but that was maybe a whistleblower. But as I said before, if there is something more behind it, beneath it, I wouldn't call this a whistleblower. That's first. Secondly, yes, we try as much as possible. That's not a good answer, but you should like to hear from me that whistleblowers are perfectly protected so that nobody would ever know about what they did. But we've tried, and we are still investigating this issue, but we have a very strict law to protect privacy. And at least you have to go back to the person against whom you are opening an investigation, even if this results in a no-go. And of course that frightens a lot of people, but because if you tell the suspect, even if it's rightly or wrongly, in the majority of cases I think he will know from where the wind blows. And so this person is not really protected. So it's nice, we're looking for it, and we try as much as we can to protect them, but it's not easy.
Yeah, it's a nice idea, but in practice, someone who is charged,
you're even not mentioning the name, you have to tell about what, then they will know how do you get to this data, and they will feel where, and you have to also sometimes include experts from the same research group, well, it's difficult then to keep it very confidential.
I think that's the same with the Stapel case, because the whistleblower was one of each PhD students, which is always very complicated, because if this PhD student has to whistleblow, it will destroy his own work as well, and it will destroy his own PhD project as well. So that makes it even more difficult to whistleblow, because it influences his or her career directly. Yeah.
If I may expand on the Stubble case as well, if I remember, the whole story was that there were at least a couple of 3 PhD students who did this undercover investigations, but there were previous allegations that had been made, or people, saying there's something wrong here, and there wasn't any follow-up. So, if you talk about, the efficiency of the system, there was clearly a problem there, to the point that these PhD students, knowing that previous allegations had gone nowhere, literally, were spying on this person for months, and secretly got hold of the data, because he famously didn't give it to anyone, and reanalyzed it and did the job that normally a Commission on Research Integrity would do. Should do. Yeah.
And maybe fraud cases are not always passed to the Commission, because a principal investigator doesn't want it to be out in the open and just dismisses a researcher without noticing it to the Commission on Science Integrity.
Well, I'm not sure I understood the question.
Well, when there is a case, in a
yes.
lab, a principal investigator maybe wants to silence it and not
then we will
giving
not
it
know.
to the Commission to investigate and just
someone
dismiss
has
someone.
to take the initiative,
Yeah.
some way or in another way. Yeah.
So you have to make researchers, PhD students, aware of
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
Commission and also the principal investigators.
So that's one of the advices that we gave and that we try, and that the university tries to implement, is that at least on in the doctoral schools every year there are sessions on scientific integrity. But in fact that's already too late. For me, that's something which should be already part of a normal master student who would then, even in normal life, to be ethically honest or not to conduct is always important. So start early, as early as possible. And that's something which is lacking, I think, at Flemish universities in general.
But what about these ethical courses they want to install or improve at universities? Is there evidence that ethical courses help in the integrity of science? Maybe Mr. Fanelli, you can respond on this.
The evidence is very ambiguous on that. There were a couple of studies, well, more than a couple, that let's put the premise that it's very difficult to actually measure the effectiveness of something like that. So what they did was to do a survey, often before the course and after the course. Yeah. And in some cases, it seemed to show that people were more ethically aware. In other cases, some studies suggested that people were more likely, were more prone to committing some kind of questionable research practice after the course than before, because they had all of a sudden learned, that's how it works. And I don't know. Are we studying? Because I'm getting the impression. Maybe I'm just anticipating you, but so far we've been talking a lot about scientific misconduct, about whistleblowing, and sort of catching the bad guys, and ethical training, and that is a bit of what the Americans have promoted a lot. Let's say that we're all indebted. We should all be indebted to the Americans, because that's where this whole discourse started. But yes, I think that we talk too little about the rest, which is probably where the biggest problem lies, and in any case is where the solutions lie, because there's only so much you can do with a system that takes in allegations, investigates, and gets people. The majority of cases will almost certainly never emerge in this way, and ethical education, again, is possibly part of the solution, but the real issue is the fact that you have a system that doesn't encourage people to behave in a certain way in the right way. And in any case, there's nothing that's in place to protect scientific knowledge itself, which ultimately is what we should be worrying more. That's, yeah.
So that's the publication pressure culture you're pointing to?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes, and so, you know, there would be arguments about how scientists are rewarded, and we mentioned those. There's, you know, the simple fact that the literature itself is, when I talk about rules, I don't mean necessarily rules on catching bad
you mean
behaviors.
Definitions.
For
yes,
example, for example, it's rules about how you should publish things, how you evaluate the literature, and so.
And also start with editors, how they behave, or reviewers, how they behave, or how are journals organized, what kind of incentives they have to publish certain results. If they mainly are driven by impact factors and the importance of their journal, well, that's already a bias of the scientific output you generate as a journal itself, and even for an editor as well, which is also influenced again by stakeholders in a company, in a publishing company, who have certain shares in the company itself. Well, the system is not that easy to change because there are so many different biases going on, which is not corrected by just one policy change. There should be more, but it starts, of course, with more awareness of the system and more awareness of the flaws in the system. Yeah.
But how those journals, they have a big role to play, and there are already initiatives to, let's say, that they peer review a certain amount of the space in the journal in another way. That the peer review, like you mentioned, Mr. Fanelli, that they are reviewed on the method, on the proposal of the research, and not on the data itself. So that they have a go or a no-go for the publication on the method and the proposal of the research, and not on the data. Then they do the data, and when the results are negative or positive, doesn't matter anymore. They have the go for publication. So that's a way to restore that positive bias in journals.
Yeah, I might expand on this. Exactly. I mean, I'm not aware of any journal that specifically have this policy, although there might be.
There are new initiatives. In psychology,
okay, well, yeah,
the domain that is affected the most.
Now premise, you know, we often talk badly nowadays about psychology, but psychology precisely because what's going on in that field will probably come out as being one of the best working disciplines in science in a few years from now. I have little doubts. Like what they're doing at the moment on all fronts is really great. About the journal issue, you know, the history was that the official reason why the system works the way it works now is that journals used to be published in paper and they didn't have space. So they needed to select. And all the more once the whole SCI started and impact factors, and they started to be evaluated and to need to gain attention to get either publicity revenues somehow, or in any case the subscriptions of libraries. Yes. Yeah. Then it became a race among journals for getting the more newsworthy studies, or at least that's the obvious risk. And so they function pretty much like any other media. But that, again, it was generated officially by a physical constraint that was there. The point that obviously very few people are open enough to discuss now is that excuse no longer holds. But interestingly, most journals, although they have an online version of them, they still maintain the old system. And that's probably down to the fact that, again, they're not rewarded in the right way. And there are courageous initiatives like PLOS ONE, for example, that kind of openly acts in going against that system, and is quite successful, so that's promising.
So an open access journal where you can publish all the data
yes,
available.
The open access aspect is separate. It's more the fact that PLOS ONE acknowledges that it has unlimited space, so it's just going to publish all studies that are technically technically and theoretically sensible. And so they do, they pay great attention to the technical validity of a paper. But they, at least, officially that's a policy. They're not blind to results, but officially they're not going to select papers based on results. And so that's probably the future.
And publishing raw data, that's one of the measurements here in Flanders. They want to take that.
You see, that's another thing I don't really buy that much, which goes a bit in the sense that we're still paying too much attention to people fabricating data. Why? Because actually, you can even see that at the moment. People like Stapel were frauding people in a completely ridiculous way. Once retrospectively, you go and see what these people were publishing in terms of statistical terminology, and obviously if you looked at the data, that was ridiculous. Okay, so obviously you would catch these people, and that's probably why we catch them. And all the famous cases are like that. It's all people that once you see, I don't know if you heard about Jan-Hendrik Schön, this was a German physicist, a postdoc. He had just started, he was working in Bell Labs, and he was publishing like one paper a month in Science, Nature, PNAS, Science, Nature, PNAS. And after 2 years, someone noticed that he was using the same graphs over and over again, declaring different findings. It's just, it's crazy. And Juan Kusuk before, that's more of a classic, because a lot of people are caught in this way. But he was manipulating figures in a way that, you can actually recognize the same cell sort of distorted a bit, or maybe with a bit more contrast somewhere else. So you wonder, people who are cleverer than them are probably never caught. And, I can tell you that any average statistician, what they would normally do to test whatever new technique they're working on is to simulate a data set. And once you do that, no one will ever see it. So, and publishing the raw data, okay, to check if your analysis were right might help, but I don't think it's going to make much of a difference.
Okay, thank you. No, well, I do not agree totally on that one, because I think the statistical methods in science are abused and misused very often, in the sense that, especially in the medical fields, I mean, doctors are doctors, and they're not statistical, very educated, unless they follow certain courses, of course. So, at least in the medical field, you see a lot of methodological errors in the papers, which directly influence the data and directly influences the results. So if you have like this a certain institute of methodologists who control certain scientists, and maybe medical scientists or psychologists, I don't know, maybe every statistical measure to check out if they use the proper one and to reanalyze the data. I think it can work in a way. Another very important thing, which if you reflect on the very fraudulent cases, is that the outliers like Stapel and like the stem cell researcher Jan-Hendrik Schön, they all worked by themselves. Even Poldermans, they worked by themselves. So they didn't have a research group. And I think one of the beautiful aspects of research is that you don't do it alone. You do it together, because that improves your knowledge about certain scientific results, but also it improves your questioning and your hypothesis and your writing as well. So I think you should always be in a research group to improve your findings, and to better. Then in cooperation, you're always better off, and you have always better ideas.
I mean, they collaborated, but they didn't.
No,
Stapel insisted on collecting data alone.
Alone, yeah, exactly, yeah.
But you see, that's for example where, the authorship QRPs, for example, come in that formally the co-authors of these papers all, technically they had signed the paper, they agreed on the study, and it is shameful that in the majority of misconduct cases, usually the story goes that one person, often a low-ranking collaborator of the team turns out to have been the one that made all the bad stuff, and everybody else didn't know anything about it, and they all come out clean. Which I'm prepared to believe they had no clue that there was going on, but that shouldn't have happened in the first place. So yeah, I agree.
So a better mentoring also is important. You have the ethical courses or courses on good research practices, but I think the mentoring in the lab itself is just crucial. When the principal investigator has the good way of doing science, he teaches it in practice to his PhD students.
Under the assumption that the mentors are on average better than the students.
Yeah.
Yeah, if your chief is cheating, how do you want your researchers not to cheat? Now, on the publication of the data, it's not on the publication. I have no meaning on that. But I think in Belgium, our universities still have to reflect on the concern whether they have a consistent policy of securing the storage of primary data. And that is something we are looking into too. Because first of all, you have to find the data. Researchers come and go like by the thousands, but where are the data? Is there a consistent policies to store them and to have something to report? That I think is an important issue for our universities. I do not know how far you are in the UK with that.
There are repositories, but not much is done. Yeah, it's that's going to be a long process as well. As I said, you made a good point that, okay, at least to replicate the study and make sure that the analysis were fine, it's probably good to have the raw data. Then if at the same time, a lot of energies and funding will have to go into creating these data repositories. And, that money could be spent in trying to replicate the studies. And, that would arguably bring benefits as well. But obviously you could have both, I suppose.
And there starts the discussion, which I've heard not in the commission, but as a copyright expert. Who owns these data? The researcher who has found them, or university? Again, another thing policy to make, I think. Because some leave with the data, and university has other authors mentioned and a corresponding author, and the data are gone.
Yeah, and that goes in another, again, if one found ways to reward researchers for doing that, because by the way, publishing your data online, it's a lot of work to make it at least understandable to anybody else. And part of the problem is that once you leave the data out there for anyone to use, people can reuse it, and at best they might acknowledge you don't really get credit. So I think there's a lot of resistance even from researchers for doing that in the first place. And again, if the system found ways to ensure that you're rewarded in terms of career, even just for having produced that data and made it available, that would probably bring a spontaneous change. Because it's pretty good evidence, by the way. There have been at least a couple of studies that tried to contact authors, even in journals where the official policy is that the author will make the data available to anyone that requires it. And as you might imagine, in most cases, they conclude that the data is never actually sent. Either it's lost or it's inefficient. And when it arrives, often it doesn't then match, or at least it doesn't allow you to replicate the study anyway. So there's all sorts of problems there.
That was a study by Jelte Wicherts, I guess, from Tilburg University. And there's a researcher, Brian Nosek, a social psychologist, who has set up a platform, open science framework, I guess, where sharing your data is just part of the whole process. It's like a sort of Facebook, where you start your study and collect the data, save the drafts, and you share with who you want, and then sharing raw data and sharing and communicating and be open in the whole process, because now only the paper is open, and when the raw data is published, that's open. But the whole, it's just when the curtain goes up, and the whole process before, there is a sort of community of researchers that want to open up that whole process. What's your opinion about that?
Well, I think to open it up as two parts. One part is the good part about the methodological issues, and the other part is that it can be misused as well. If you open up on the internet, everybody can do statistical analysis on your data. And of course, you have to have permission, but then it can be very skewed or confused by authors, but also by editors who collected the data, whose authors are on the list, are they contributed to the data, is the principal investigator the guy who managed the data, or is it the guy who collected the data, or is it the guy who did the research or did the analysis? Well, you will get a lot of other problems on having public data, which is possible to overcome, but still, if the reward of publishing scientific papers is an authorship, which is the main issue for most people who are sharing data, that well, in not all the fields, but in most fields it is, then you are very conservative of sharing data, because you don't know if you're going to be on the paper, if somebody else do a reanalysis of your data. Complicated.
Yeah, if I may follow up on that, and there's definitely a delicate balance, also because we should not, I think, make the mistake of battering too much current practices, and that you know, the fact that we are somehow getting researchers to publish in absolute terms is obviously not a bad thing. No. Even more, we shouldn't forget that competition was always a driving force in science, you know, and indeed there was a great, let's say he was a sociologist of science, not exactly, but called Derek Desola Price, and he by the way founded the Web of Science and the Institute of Scientific Information, so he's responsible indirectly for the impact factor, I guess. But he did a lot of fantastic work on science using this kind of data, and he described science in a perfect way, I think, as a conspiracy that harnesses the selfishness, if you like, and the egoism of people towards producing what is collectively objective knowledge, and that's what it is. So we discuss problems in the system. At the same time, not everything might be negative about what's going on. And some even have argued that actually it's a bit like democracy. You know, like there's no one, I think, living in a democratic country that couldn't think of ways that it should work better. At the same time, no one can come up with a better system, really. And so, yeah.
But it is a capitalistic system then, because the rewards are there, and it's reward driven. So the reward, if a publication is the reward for even more money to do more research, then it's very a capitalistic system, which well, as in our society as well, gives unequal chances to everybody, of course. But still, well, it's better than communism.
But what's the role of funding agencies here? And you have the role of journals, okay, there are limits to it, but funding agencies, what can they do to diminish that publication pressure?
Well, lately, what I saw I saw a guy who wrote a paper to get funded, and he got a comment on it, and the first lines were. There was the question was, why is this specific scientist capable of doing right things with the fund? And the first thing they wrote down was, well, if you see on his publication record, he published several publications, and his Hirsch index was 8, so he must be a good scientist, which is of course partly true, because he has proven already that he publishes a lot, but still. It's then judged by previous successes, and well, what I think there must be more than only quantitative scientific output measurement. There must be more focus on and emphasis on the clinical relevance of the work, or the originality of the work, or even the risk ratio for their work when you perform their work and there won't be any results. It must be rewarded as well, unless the results are not there, but it improves the scientific knowledge, of course.
What funding organizations could do, I'm just taking something I read already in Nature 2011 for the European Union, when they're thinking of Horizon 2020. It's not, I'm not sure whether it's already a plan, but what they can do is they should have signed an ethics declaration confirming to the one who receives the grant that they should abide by the European Code, something to, and every funding organization could do that. Even universities could have that as a more explicit rule. Have people sign something, makes them sometimes realize twice, and you can get after them more easily.
Maybe on the long term it will be just crossing.
Well, but not mentioning it is always, it's better to mention it than not to mention it, I would say.
But you mentioned replications
funding
as
replication.
one of the criteria, but how can you do that?
Well, that's not very difficult, because the way the system works at the moment, and we had an excellent vignette before, is that the funders are looking for something that's going to be new, extraordinarily important, and in a sense, they're asking you to know what you're aiming at and what you'll produce before you even do the study. And that's just the logic with which then funding is distributed. If it was made mandatory or, mandatory, that funding agencies had to devolve, 10% of the budget to replication studies, then, then problem solved. Because then you would be applying for a project not to do something that's pioneering, extraordinarily true, and extraordinarily new, and it's going to have a big impact. But you're simply saying a very interesting replication. There was this study that suggested something really important. Maybe it's a study that was amply reported in the media and it had this big impact. No one has actually tried to see if it really works the way it says. And I want to do that. And you have a competition about who's going to replicate the most interesting studies. And and that will then start people having a career in doing these kind of studies. We're not supposed all to be Einstein, all to be, explorers of the endless frontiers. There's nothing wrong in being cleverly normal.
That brings us to maybe the last subject, replication. There's a replication problem, I would say.
Now what's happening in psychology, for example, it's all of a sudden people are coming out with these studies that sometimes had tried to replicate other people's findings, didn't succeed, and didn't know where to place them. And there's a dangerous tendency to present these as embarrassments. So famous findings that now it turns out that there's 10 studies that contradict them, and so presumably they are wrong. And that becomes big news in the sort of media way, which is bad news is good news, right? So, and that is a dangerous tendency, because actually what is really going on in psychology is that finally science is working the way it should. And the only mistake we make, and we're still making it and we should change, and the media actually is partly responsible for this, is that the first study to come out claiming anything should be ignored, because it's very likely that it's not going to be true anyway. Whereas we reason in the opposite way. The first study, it's showing something, and that's all we care about. And then, even if actually then turns out to be false, no one will ever know about it. And that generates a lot of confusion in our public understanding of science, and it's actually what, as we've just been discussing so far, is actually the way the scientific system itself is going, and it shouldn't.
Well, a funny example of that is that everybody thinks, at least in the Netherlands, it's if you drink 2 glasses of wine a day, it's healthy. It was investigated in the 70s, and I think they didn't replicate it for years, but it turned out that you need to drink maybe 10 million liters of wine to have this effect on your health, which is the first scientist who did it. He investigated and he thought, well, maybe this amount of this particular substance is good for your health, is good for your vascular system. But when they replicated it, they couldn't find it. And after then, they discovered that you needed so much more of the substance that it was irrelevant, the 2 glasses of wine. But still, we believe it because it was this finding in the 70s. But another example, which contradicts the first example, is that Don Polderman, the cardiologist, he was caught because the replication studies of one of his Nature publications, the replications could not find his findings, could not confirm his findings. So that's where the research started, and where they said, well, already 3 studies tried to replicate this finding, and they couldn't find it. So what's wrong with the data of him? And that's where the investigation started. Which is another side, of course, which proves that replication is very, very important for science, because it can. That's science. I mean, we increase the amount of knowledge, and with the total amount of knowledge, which we do in meta-analysis, we can make more proper conclusions. Yeah.
But again, let's emphasize the fact that it's easily to prove statistically that in most fields of research, a finding, a statistically significant finding, it would be long to explain how the whole thing normally works, but it's actually very likely not to be true anyway. And not because anyone has been cheating, that's just the way it works. And yeah, I mean, before we were mentioning statistics, and in addition to having education on ethics, I think what's really needed in science a lot is good statistical education on all disciplines. I can speak for myself. In evolutionary biology, we had the basic training in null hypothesis, statistical testing, which all gets, and it was only later when I became interested in these problems that I started to read books and study, the incredible, by the way, fascinating controversy around and the logic around how these tests work, and then so you get to knowing these things, such as the one I just said. And if people knew this from the start, I think they would have a different attitude towards their own research, and a lot of the fudging that we've been talking about would probably go away, because I think most people are good intentioned in what they do. I think a lot of people are entering into science to be good scientists and to do a good work. If they're not trained to accept failure or not expect a success all the time, then that's probably where the problem really begins.